Please forgive me if my introduction contains a lot of points that you already know about. And I think one of my key points that I'll leave you with is really the importance of interacting with people outside your field, but also in the communities that we deal with. In my case, primarily West Africa, but also Indian Ocean, small island developing states. So first of all, a definition. We all know that archaeology is the science of recovering the past through material remains. So whatever has survived the test of time. I think what tends to be forgotten, because people think it's about things, I think what people tend to forget is archaeology is also about a deep engagement with people today. So wherever you're working, you will be dealing with the communities which occupy the piece of land that you're investigating. And also, much of your data have relevance to the present situation. So most archaeologists, I think it's fair to say, are also at heart anthropologists. They have a much reduced data set, but what they're interested in is people, not so much things. Some of them are really obsessed with the things, but largely we're more interested in the people. So this actually is from the latest issue of Antiquity, which is one of the key global journals in our field, and there's a whole series of debates entitled The Brexit Hypothesis and Prehistory. In this piece, archaeologist Nathan Schlanger talks about the probable aspirations of the local reactionary populism, whose liberalism is strictly economic rather than political or cultural. And that narrative is about taking back control of borders, laws, and heritage. So archaeologists and people working in heritage generally keep popping up in really odd sectors, and then you've got Stonehenge, and you've got a whole rhetoric about what it is to be British and an island, and a lot of archaeological data being used, indeed misused, in that context. So this was just a sort of odd slide at the beginning to get you thinking perhaps about the wider ramifications of dealing with data from the past. My own stuff has been much more your sort of daily archaeology, shall we say. My biggest involvement was through an ERC project, which concluded in 2015, and which I led with a range of collaborators in Benin, and the local university, Abomey-Calavi, was our lead partner there. And I think the engagement of archaeologists with present-day questions is true wherever you go, but I think from my point of view, particularly in these very remote areas where we pitch up and we stay for 5 or 6 weeks in a local village and go dig our little trenches and talk to people, we have a particularly close relationship in the community. In this area, we know very little. This is one of those parts of Africa which gets totally overlooked in historical narratives because there's no historical written data. So anything you want to know, you need to get from the archaeological record. So this is on the Niger River, and it's a point at which the Niger, having been practically up to the Sahara and then coming back down through Niger, is finally getting a bit more of its energy back and opens up into a really wide, quite rich inland Niger Delta. Lots of things to be said here about exploitation, increasing growth of genetically modified cotton and rice. These are issues that people are quite upset about locally, but I only know about them anecdotally. This is what we do. This is a map created by one of my former doctoral students, and it shows places at which basically we identified evidence of past settlement. And I'm going to go back to this map later on. I just wanted to show you, it's perhaps not terribly exciting, but this is what it looks like. Now the point here, these are elevations in the landscape, and all this stuff is broken pottery or remains of walls. So it may look like nothing, but once you get your eye in and you start seeing this everywhere, it is actually quite mind-boggling, because these areas are not particularly densely settled at this time, apart from, of course, the river bank. This is the kind of stuff we find. If we're lucky, it's essentially items that people have discarded. Again, we are totally hostages of the nature of our material. Only stuff that... This stuff is about 1,000 years old. So you're not going to get textiles or any kind of direct behavioral evidence. What you do get, however, which will be, I'm sure, very interesting to people in this room, is you do get crop remains, particularly in the sites that we've sampled a bit more fully, and you sieve everything to a very fine grade. And we have been able to show what kinds of things people were eating, and also what the environment may have been like. So here, this mound is enormous, 26 hectares, and was abandoned about 1300 AD. And through the sequence, which is 1,000 years old, we could see what kind of things people were eating. I'm talking mainly about crops, but we can see which animals they were exploiting as well. Pearl millet, sorghum, and African rice were key elements of their diet. The rice, people were so excited locally to know that their ancestors had been eating rice. For some reason, it was really pertinent in local minds. The analysis of the charcoal fragments has suggested an agroforestry parkland environment dominated by shea butter and other useful trees, and a regular exploitation of riverside vegetation. So altogether, these data point to a slightly wetter environment at that point than it is now. So, to go back to this map, I did threaten to do that. These are not all points that we managed to date, but we can roughly indicate their age based on the kind of stuff that occurs there. What is interesting is you've got an abundance of archaeological sites clustering around rivers, which is probably not that surprising. Most of the sites seem to date between 800 and 1400. And it's quite curious that after that date, we don't really find any of these mound settlements much more. And I will go back to this. A point about the engagement, so we pitch up and we dig these little holes using members of the local community. We are introduced by the local dignitaries. We operate with research permits, and the whole hierarchy is informed of our presence. We often have town hall meetings to explain what it is we look for, because in Benin, as in Switzerland, people come and they say, oh, are you looking for gold? Are you looking for your ancestors? So there's a lot of explaining. This is not unique to West Africa. People always are quite curious to know what it is we're looking for and suspect that we have motivations which we do not, i.e. searching for treasure. And I think Indiana Jones hasn't helped in that regard. They're so disappointed to see what we actually find, and then they think maybe we're selling the potsherds. And it's like, no, nobody wants to buy them. So we go back, and this was actually my anthropologist colleagues insisted, and they were quite right to do so, that we designated the whole field season at the end of the project to go back to the villages, and with lots of visuals, because literacy rate here is about 17%, to go to the villages and use visuals and local interpreters and a whole range of different strategies and tell people what it is. They welcomed us for 4 years into their region, so we go back and say, at this point, this is what we know. So that's what we did in 2015. And again, these informants are absolutely fundamental. These people know where the archaeological sites are, and they all have ideas about them. Some of them are historically actually more accurate than anything we could ever do. So if it's the 19th century settlement which preceded that one, these people can tell you that. We cannot find it for various scientific reasons that I won't go into. So that's about the engagement and the sort of fact that we have, I'd like to think, this really good interdependency with the people who've helped us throughout the years. So, fine, climate change. So apologies to those of you who know this, but climate change is really hot topic in archaeology at the minute, and there have been quite some contentious points made about the fact that civilizations collapse because of the climate change. Now, proving this causality is actually very difficult, and there have been some very broad brush things that have been said about this. I was at a meeting in Cambridge and they pointed me to this absolutely terrible academic argument which unfolded in the pages of Science, no less. And the reason that this has proved very acrimonious is that the very eminent International Commission on Stratigraphy, which is one of the oldest and largest parts of the International Union of Geological Sciences, has decided that our current epoch, the Holocene, should be split into 3 very short ones. These are some of the shortest periods ever seen in geology. You know, we go way back to the Pliocene and all of this. And the final one, which is called the Meghalaya, after a site in northern India, is actually linked in with the occurrence of a very severe drought about 4,200 years ago. The argument, and I actually don't think anybody thinks this is true, but the argument has been made that this drought was so widespread and traumatic that it caused the collapse of all these very famous ancient civilizations. Through, as you can see, Asia and Africa and Europe, throughout the old world, basically. So that would have been 4,200 years ago. You get evidence for a very severe drought. which has been found by archaeologists, paleoenvironmentalists, etc. Now, the link with collapse, from everything I've read, doesn't work. I want to hasten to add that. It isn't such a close correlation between this environmental change and the collapse of all these wonderful civilizations, but the key point, the reason I'm mentioning it, is that it links archaeological and geological data, and for the first time, because most of these other eras, the human presence was negligible and the impact on the environment was negligible. Here we have climate change, which is coming in as a key consideration in all of this. So I'm just going to mention a project I was very interested to hear about when I was in Cambridge recently, which is also an ERC-funded project. And the Indus Civilization is one of those intriguing ones which suddenly collapsed, and nobody quite knows why. It's South Asia's first complex society. It developed across a whole range of very distinctive environmental and ecological zones. And you've got westerly winter rains overlapping with the Indian summer monsoon, hence the name of the project, Two Rains. And the lead is Cameron Monroe from the University of Cambridge. And the suggestion is that the location of this civilization in a part of the world that receives both winter and summer rain would have made it uniquely suited to resilience, and that it encouraged development of seasonal crop rotation way before some of the other major civilizations in the world. And they've tied that into some of the current debates over water scarcity throughout India, and their field of inquiry is up here. So as you can see, deeply problematic in terms of water availability. So the idea is that the people of the Indus civilization, who were used to a predictably unpredictable climate, suddenly were faced with more unpredictability than they could cope with, and moved eastwards to areas where they could develop a more diverse environmental crop strategy. And again, funny way in which these things get taken up by the media. This is the pottery, the potsherds that this team was collecting, and this is the coverage they get in the Mirror, which is basically, just very briefly, archaeologists, probably boffins or someone, have discovered that rice was cultivated in India at the same time farming techniques were developed in China, 400 years earlier than previously thought. The new information confirms that the Indus people were the world's earliest farmers, after they were previously thought to have learned rice farming techniques from the Chinese, which is all true and all very interesting. But you get to this kind of headline, which is a tiny bit mysterious to me. But anyway, it makes a good story. So I'm going to go back to my stuff now. I realize I'm running short on time. This is the map I showed you earlier, and I mentioned that after 1400, we don't seem to identify any of the large sites that we'd seen previously, and we did wonder, of course, about climate change, because other parts of West Africa see this pattern at around the same time. So you're looking for a large-scale event. Disease is the other one that's often mentioned, because this would have been a regional phenomenon. And again, land-people interactions are a really big topic in this archaeology, as in any parts of the world. And this is fundamentally interdisciplinary work, because you need climate scientists, you need soil experts, you need archaeologists, anthropologists, you have a whole range of techniques linked to it. So it's in itself entirely interdisciplinary. But I was quite interested to see that the data do seem to suggest a drier period at exactly the time that we see our sites disappearing. So again, I say this cautiously, I don't think there's a one-on-one correlation, but it's just thinking about possibilities. And I owe this insight to my colleague in Brussels who pointed me to this. Now, just in the final few slides, I want to talk a tiny bit about where I'm moving now. I'm continuing to work in Benin, but I've moved 800 kilometers to the south to the coastline, because I'm very interested with the colleagues from Abomey-Calavi to think about how we might become involved in the current government's extensive plans to bolster tourism in Benin. They want to quadruple the share of GDP of tourism. Tourism is the second earner in Benin after cotton, earner of foreign earnings. In Ghana, I know that there's a similar plan afoot to develop a lot of the tourist industry. And in Benin, what's interesting is that it is entirely or greatly axed around, centered on heritage. and on the transatlantic slave trade. So they have very ambitious plans to create 4 new museums, to build a replica slaving ship, and all of the debate on the repatriation of African cultural heritage, which you've probably heard about, kind of feeds into that, because Benin would be one of the early recipients of the looted materials. So we've been looking at coastal erosion, actually, and this is a lovely environment. The Mono River starts in Togo, runs over 400 kilometers, draining 20,000 square kilometers, goes into the Atlantic in this area, which is a nature reserve. Erosion is very, very prevalent. It's increased sedimentation as well. It's a very big concern for the people locally, and it's something that we've been noticing. You can't help but notice. If you walk along the sides of the islands, you will find archaeological material, usually European, post-contact, so 1500 onwards. Cannonballs, ceramics, pipes, and it's just lying in the river. They also told us the depth of the river has decreased majorly in the last 10 years. So this is a very, very quickly moving environment. So we did, it was largely a training excavation with 8 of the current archaeology students of Abomey-Calavi and 2 postdocs that I've worked with for a long time. The stuff we found is I stole this from the internet, but it's the same kind of stuff. It's European, probably Dutch manufactured pipes. I haven't got a good picture because it stayed in Benin. There's one of the students there is doing his MA dissertation on it. One of my MAs is looking at the pottery, so she's just come back from Benin. Cowries is something I've been very interested in the past, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about cowrie shells, but I won't do so now. And the imports, you've got a bit of European stuff, but it's largely locally made pottery, we think, earthenwares. So it gives you a bit of indication about the encounter in the post-European period between the incomers and the local communities. And we were working with a local NGO because this is a nature reserve, and they put us up in their premises, and their interest in our project was to try and develop, they say the tourists they get are very interested in knowing a bit more about the history of the area. So they were bringing us on board to sort of enhance their tourist offer, and we did get a lot of questions, actually. As soon as people see a trench, they come and look at you and say, what are you doing? So we were working alongside this NGO, which primarily has been concerned with the preservation of biodiversity and the animal species in the area. It's a big nesting site for 4 kinds of turtle, and mangrove and other projects. Mangrove replanting is much of what they do. But on the back of our experience here last June, this guy made a brief film, interviewed a number of us, and then put it up on YouTube. So the idea is, again, to try and add a tiny bit more of the archaeology and history. I have a real problem with the way that Sub-Saharan Africa is often portrayed as lacking in any history whatsoever. That's completely wrong, and that you should get people like Nicolas Sarkozy saying that in public a few years ago is absolutely shocking. So for me, part of this work is really important to show people that there was actually quite a lot of activity happening, and this, of course, ties in with priorities from our local colleagues. Final slide is something I was pointed to, the Drawdown project, which aims to bridge the divide between urgency and agency. So they look at the main reasons, the main factors for the emission of CO2 gases. And their idea is that these are the top 20 solutions that can be used to reverse global warming. And they also cite one of the lead authors of the IPCC's 5th assessment, who said that we have the technologies, but, and I think this is a direct quote, we really have no sense of what it would take to deploy them at a larger scale, which I think ties in with the previous 2 speakers very well. And what I wanted to leave you with here, before I say thank you, is that most of these solutions go through the implementation of people. You have to engage with people and get them, or us, or anybody, to change their behavior. And if you're not talking to people on the ground, then needless to say, that's going to be very challenging to do. So most of these require people to, in the communities concerned and the communities wherever they may be in the globe, to be changing the way they do things. And I think that's where you really, my point would be, you need the arts and humanities and the social sciences in order to do that, because that's part of what we do. It's the construction of meaning, how people construct meaning of the landscape, how they use resources. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry this has been a bit quick. Thank you.